Okay, so next we're going to add some colour to our character and we're going to get the grid set up to match our scene. The first thing you're going to want to do is, you can see over here we've got R, G and B. That's red, green and blue. That's alright for doing pixel art, but when you're wanting to find shades of a consistent colour, if you change the slider, it's going to alter it to lots of weird things. So if you click on this little box here, this little drop down, it'll bring up a bunch of other colour possibilities. LAB slider I've found is the best one to go for, because you can create, you know, a colour, and then you can move the light slider. So rather than RGB, you've got L, A and B. Now L stands for light, and then you've got your two channels of colour A and B. So if I've just moved that down a little bit, so then I can move it up a little bit past the previous colour and create a nice little bit of shading, you know, which is subtle, but it can make quite a bit of difference to your design of whatever you're making. So yeah, that's the colour setting that I work with. So now let's set the grid up. So if I turn on the grid now, I'm just going to switch that on, go View, Show, Grid, you can see here, especially if I turn off the pixel grid, that the grid isn't aligned to my character. I could just have the pixel grid on, but the problem is when I start to have lots of different images, you know, squares of frames of animation, it's going to be hard to determine which area around belongs to which frame of animation. So I'm going to go to Photoshop, Preferences, Guides, Grids and Slices. Now for you on Windows, it'll be under Edit, just so you know. So you can see on here, this is set to inches and is completely useless for us. I'm going to switch to pixels, and I'm going to set it to 32 pixels. So a grid line every 32 pixels. So the whole image is one giant grid line. And all these little lines in between are subdivisions. Match the number of subdivisions to the number of grid lines. And that way you'll get your pixel grid. But when we expand the image, you'll be able to see some more defined lines dividing up the frames. So we also want to switch off snap. Because if I'm using the grid, sometimes it'll colour in the wrong square, as you can see here. This is because it's snapping to the pixel grid when it doesn't need to, because every line is a grid line and it gets confused. So we're going to go to View and Disable Snapping, and that way you'll always colour in the area that your brush is hovering over. Right, let's get colouring in this character. So to get started with him, I'm going to use the Paint Bucket tool. Now for you, it's gonna, if you're using Photoshop for the first time, you're going to have the gradient tool as visible where the Paint Bucket tool would usually be. So click on it, as the same way we did with the brush, and click on the drop down to the Paint Bucket tool. So I'm going to, from LAB slider, pick a colour. I'm going to choose like a nice pinky colour. Now if I try colour in now, that seems like that's okay. The problem is I've got a thing called anti-aliasing on. So if I just quickly disable it and set a much darker colour, whoops, just gonna, if I bring this into Stencilworks as it is now, the way Stencil works, works, and a lot of softwares figure out transparent colors, is they choose one color in the same way that green screening does to make transparent, which in this case would be white. So if I get rid of the white, or fill it in with what would be the background, this character now has a bright white line around him. Now, this might look alright in this situation, but if you're working with a high definition image, or I'm trying to think of another example, but I've seen a lot of projects in the past where people don't realize that they've got anti-aliasing on, and it makes their images look, it looks not great. I can link some examples of it if needs be, but hopefully this shows it enough why it needs addressing. So the way you can fix that is by going to anti-aliasing and making sure it's unticked. The same applies for the Magic Wand tool. That needs to be unticked. And the same for the lasso tool. If I try and select this and then move, it's going to leave like a load of fuzzy lines, which won't translate well when you bring them into the software. So I'm going to use the Paint Bucket tool to fill in our character without anti-aliasing now. And then I'm just going to add some basic shading to him. Maybe getting some clothes would be a good idea. Okay. Use the Paint Bucket tool again to fill out the rest of his body. Let me see. So now I can use shading to add a little bit of color to him, a little bit of lighting. If you want to have a preview of what your character looks like at a larger size, you can go to Window, Navigator, and it will give you like a little preview of what your character looks like at its full size. Which is pretty useful, so you don't have to keep zooming in and zooming out. It also gets rid of the grid lines, so it's a little easier to spot some problems. So, okay, I'm going to make this guy a little eye, and a little mouth, and I'm going to give him a slightly darker underside of his mouth, so you can determine his head from his neck. Okay. No idea what this is meant to be, by the way. Kind of looks like a Birdman kind of thing. So you can probably see this thing popping up from time to time. This is the color sampler. If I want to grab a color that I've previously used, I can hold down Alt or click over on the eyedropper tool over here and sample a previous color. And that will mean that it'll speed up your workflow rather than trying to kind of go on here and guess what the color's going to be. In particular, when you're wanting to find white again, that's very useful, because a lot of people I've seen try and do this. Sometimes if they're trying to find white again, what they'll do is they'll kind of guess it on these sliders and be like, well, this kind of looks like white, so I guess I'll go with that. The problem is that, as I mentioned before, most softwares that do transparency for their images, they will only use one color code, which means if you're slightly off, you'll have all of those kind of imperfect colors still, existent on your image. So you'll end up with something like that. We'll have like blotchy white bits all over your image, which is not great. So, yeah, stick to stick to using the eyedropper. Okay. So I'm kind of happy with this, I guess. Maybe add a little bit of chest hair or something, I don't know. A little bit of... Cool. And a little bit of stubble. Actually, no, because that makes his neck disappear. Okay, yeah, I'm just tinkering and wasting your time. So I will... This should be good for this. The next thing that I'll be covering will be creating your different images for your character.